Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the principle of emphasis, which is a way of creating focal points in your work. So emphasis is when you have one area of the work that really stands out compared to other areas, and usually those areas, if they're small enough, become focal points. So points that our eye is going to go to first. Some pieces of art don't have a focal point or an area of emphasis. Many do. And some pieces of art even have multiple focal points that will work differently for different people depending on what we tend to look at first. But all of the examples that I'm going to show you have one really obvious focal point and really obvious way of using emphasis. So some really easy way to create focal points would be to use size. So here we have a black circle. It's the same value as all the other circles, the same color. It's in pretty much the same pattern, but it's smaller. And so that becomes an area of emphasis and a focal point because our eye immediately goes to that smaller circle since it's different from all the other circles. Another easy way to create emphasis is by location, so where you locate objects on your composition. And so because this tree is right in the center of the composition and it's kind of surrounded by some empty space, our eye is automatically going to go to that tree before we look at anything else. And then, similar to the tree, we can also isolate a subject. So even though whatever this is, maybe a ball, is very small, it's a different shape than everything else that is in the picture. It's circular, everything else is very rectangular, and it's closer to us, and it's also kind of alone on this very flat piece of floor. And so our eye immediately goes to this small object first. So isolation is just when you have a lot of empty space or flat space around an object. So now we're going to talk about how the different elements of art can be used to create emphasis. And the first one is line. So here we have this little shape in the middle. So we have a centered object. So we're using placement or location to create emphasis, but we're also using lines. So all of these lines are diagonal. And then here we have 4 horizontal and vertical lines. So just the difference in those lines is going to create emphasis. And then here we do have emphasis with color as well, but all of these lines are circular in a radial pattern. And all of these lines are going in an opposite direction. So they're not quite perpendicular to these lines because these lines are curved lines, but they're going in a completely different direction. And they're also slightly different sizes than these lines. And so even if this was a black and white photo, these would still be the area of emphasis because they go in a different direction. So another way to create emphasis is to use different shapes. We actually have 2 different types of emphasis here, or 2 different areas of emphasis, because we have a large circular shape in amongst all of these very rectangular shapes. And then we have smaller circular shapes here. So your eye might go to this row of smaller circles first, or it might go to the larger circle first. But the emphasis is being created by a different shape than the majority of the composition, which is made up of rectangular shapes. And then just like shape, we can create emphasis by using different forms. So the form of the starfish is very different than the form of the rocks. You'll notice that the texture is pretty similar and the value isn't too different. It is lighter, but even if this was darker, we would still notice it because the form, remember form is 3-dimensional, is really different than these forms that are around it. So obviously we can use value to create emphasis. So here we have similar forms. They're all pawns from a game of chess. And we have a similar range of values. So we have lights and grays and blacks. But this piece is white. It's also centered. So again, we're using both location and value here to create an area of emphasis. So you can also create emphasis in space, and with space or with any image that has depth, you tend to naturally have areas of emphasis. And when you have a drawing or photograph with depth, usually the objects that are closest to the viewer are going to be the objects that we look at first. They're typically going to be bigger objects, and this is a little bit bigger than the pillows in the back if you go all the way from the bottom to the very top. The colors are the same. There is some difference in texture, but it's really the size and the level of detail that create that emphasis, as well as the fact that it's further down the page. And we always interpret things that are further down the page towards the bottom as being closer to us. It's overlapping, so it's covering up other objects, and we can see all of this object, at least the side that is facing us, whereas some of these objects are covered up by other objects. And so all of those ways that we create depth and space in a drawing are going to lend themselves to giving us a point of emphasis, unless we do something really differently in the background that draws the viewer's eye towards the back of the page, like using a different color that stands out. So that brings us to color. Color is a really easy way to create a focal point. But this is one way that I want to, or one thing that I want to point out to you as being a way that you can inadvertently create different focal points for other people. So if someone was colorblind and you were using reds and greens and let's say a blue, and you were using all kinds of blues but one small area of red, the red wouldn't stand out to the viewer because they can't see that red. They're seeing it as gray. So that's one of the ways in which different interpretations, different ways of seeing, in this case a physical effect on how we see is going to change how we interpret a focal point in an image. Here we have a really obvious focal point where we have this yellow-orange fish, and then everything else is black and white and gray. And so of course the fish stands out. And then here we have a red object in amongst all kinds of blue objects. And this is where if you were red-green colorblind, you might see this as gray and these as kind of bluish grays. And so this might still be a focal point because it's off to the side. It's at a different angle than the other little balls and strings, but you might not see the color. So here I'm not red-green colorblind, so I can see that this circle is clearly red, and I can see that it is also in a different location than the other circle. So automatically that becomes a focal point. And then finally we can have texture create a focal point. So here of course we have size and we have space, so this is a bit closer in space than most of what's in the background. But there's a big contrast in texture between the softer texture of the feather and the rough texture of the sand, and even rough textures in the sky with the clouds and the ocean. So we have very different textures here, and that really draws your eye to the feather. And then I thought this was a great student example of texture, how different textures can create a focal point. So I'm going to focus immediately on this part of the, I guess this is an island, a floating island of some kind, but I'm focusing on this rough orange area because, well, the color is the same between these two, and both the top part and the bottom part are centrally located and pretty even. It's not perfectly symmetrical, but it's close. And then you have the lines down here which kind of continue into this shape. So we don't really have a difference in line down here. We don't have a difference in color. We don't have a difference in location, but we do have a big difference in texture. And so the texture at the top draws my eye because it's different than all the other textures in the piece. And so that is the end of this presentation, and those are the ways that you can create emphasis in art.